Welcome back to Beyond the Books. My name is Beth Price, and I have the privilege of hosting this podcast where every week we go behind the scenes in the School of Literatures, Languages and Cultures, otherwise known as LLC, in the University of Edinburgh, and I get to talk to one of the researchers, everyone from PhD students to senior lecturers. I get to find out about their research, their academic journey, and just anything else going on. This week I got to sit down with Dr. Xuelei Huang from the Asian Studies Department. Xuelei happens to also be one of my PhD supervisors, but she is a senior lecturer in Chinese studies. Previously, she studied at Fudan University in Shanghai, Peking University in Beijing, and she got her PhD from the University of Heidelberg in Germany. She joined Edinburgh as a Chancellor's Fellow, became a lecturer in 2016, and has been a senior lecturer here since 2019. We talk about her experience researching Chinese history in China and outside of China, her research on Chinese film, and then her move into researching smell. Xuelei, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I'll kick off really straightforwardly with, in 60 seconds or thereabouts, can you tell me about your research?
I think I'm a fox type of scholar, which means that my research has followed different paths. Generally speaking, I'm a cultural historian of modern China, that is the 19th and 20th centuries. My research started with film history, especially silent cinema and its broader media context in the early 20th century. I published my first book on that topic. Then I moved on to sensory history. I wrote my second book on the cultural history of smell in modern China, exploring sensory perceptions and larger historical forces, how they are, intertwined. So overall, I'm interested in the soft side of history, cultural artifacts, common people, and even as tiny as smells. But they are never trivial in my view. They can tell a lot about politics and social change.
I start most of these interviews off by thinking about the academic journey, which is something that I don't like the term of, because it feels quite like you're putting a narrative on it that doesn't necessarily exist. But for the sake of it, could you tell me a bit about your academic journey? How did you come to be a senior lecturer in Edinburgh?
Actually, my first degree was in media studies and journalism. So at that time, my dream was to become a filmmaker, especially documentary filmmaker. But then later I went to postgraduate. In China, we call it master's degree anyway. Then I was inspired by, I think, some of the best scholars in China. I went to the Peking University, and then I was inspired by their work, by their teaching, and then I thought, I want to be a scholar as well. So that's how I got started. And then I applied a PhD. So I did a PhD in Germany. Then afterwards did a postdoc and then applying for a job in Edinburgh, and I got it. So that's why I am here.
Was it quite a straightforward decision to apply to Edinburgh? Was it, this job's available, great, Edinburgh sounds nice, or was there more of a plan behind it?
No, there wasn't a plan behind it. After PhD, this is always a time period. Fate is not in your hands. Yeah, actually, that wasn't straightforward. During my postdoc, I was applying for jobs, and then I received so many rejections. And then I applied for some grants at the same time, because I thought that you have to find something, right? So that's why I developed my second project. And of course, for all sorts of reasons, I don't know, I got 4 grants at the same time. Then I juggled and I took some, and then that allowed me to do research in France, in Austria and in Germany. So I applied for different kinds of jobs, academic jobs, and then Edinburgh chose me. So
going back to Chinese cinema and what I'm calling Republican media,
thanks.
What is Republican China to start off with?
Yeah, Republican China officially started in 1912. After the fall of the Qing dynasty. That was the final dynasty in Chinese history. So Republican China normally marks the start of China's modernization, if you like, in a simple term. But then China wasn't really very politically, socially stable at that time. So Republican China became a transition period, and that makes it fascinating for scholars, right, to explore the different directions of different changes and inspirations and challenges.
Can you tell me a bit more about the social, the cultural side of Republican China? If we were in Shanghai in 1920s, what would we be seeing? What would we be hearing? What would we be watching?
The Republican China mediascape was extremely vibrant and diverse. If we think about media in China, probably the stereotype goes that it is censorship, restrictions, and political taboos, and so on and so forth. But the Republican era was definitely not the case. This is a very politically chaotic time period, and China changed governments quite frequently during the 3 decades, and China was also hit by war and political conflicts and so on and so forth. But the upside is that the governments are too busy to do their own business. Then the cultural atmosphere became more relaxed. There was less censorship, less restrictions. There are instances of censorship for sure, but it's not as strict as today. This is one reason. Then another reason, this is a time of crisis almost, right, for many Chinese people, Chinese intellectuals. So they wanted to understand the issue, want to grapple with the difficulties and challenges. So this creates an atmosphere for the mediascape to flourish in different directions. That's the softer side of the story.
I think the other side of it was Shanghai was such an international city. And in my research, I'm calling it semi-colonialism. Unlike Hong Kong, Shanghai wasn't ruled by the British or the Americans or the French, but there were parts of the city that they weren't protected zones at that point, I don't think. I think Chinese people could live in the French settlement, but it was quite heavily Europeanized in a way. So you see a lot of different influences in terms of the print media and the art. There's that side of the explosion of creativity as well, a real change of social influences on the creatives.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I would like to call it cultural cosmopolitanism, because if we frame it in political terms as inevitably, colonialism, imperialism, and all these negative forces, right? But if you think about the cultural theme, actually, the cultural cosmopolitanism means the divergence and the convergence of different forces in media and in cultural production. So that is something I think for common people, these are the things they get exposed to, and they are inspired by cultural products. So that's the way we can think about the Republican era mediascape.
And then cinema specifically within that mediascape.
Cinema was invented in 1905 in France. Then actually immediately afterwards, because at that time this was a business, right? So these showmen, they took the films and they travel across the world to showcase this new invention. Because Shanghai was one of the earliest stops. So that's before the Republican era. But then, of course, there was no filmmaking involved at that time. In the early 1910s, some earliest Chinese film companies started, or I call it companies, actually just a couple of people, a few people, getting together and making some rudimentary films. So that's in the early to mid 1910s. So in early 1920s, some more reasonably established film studios started to operate.
And what sort of stories were they telling in their films? Were they traditional Chinese folk stories and myths that they were putting on film, or were they completely new, or were they retelling other Western stories?
When we talk about cultural form like a film, this is certainly a Western form of a new technology, right? You would immediately think, oh yeah, then Chinese films might be influenced by Hollywood, by French films, and that's for sure. But ultimately, I think cultural artifacts, they are always really rooted in its own environments. So when you talk about the films, one of the first genres that became really successful was family melodrama. So, moral stories, moral teachings, that is very much the Confucian culture. But then it was articulated in the filmic way, which also means that they added a little bit more like the Western melodrama or the dramatic elements in it. So this is one of the genres that was really, really popular at the beginning. And afterwards, there was another genre that is the martial arts film and costume dramas. So that was in the mid-1920s to late 1920s. This genre became so popular that eventually the government decided to censor it because the government wanted to have something more modern looking. They talk about superstition, talk about old Chinese fairy tales. That's considered backward.
Interesting. So like the modern media form had to be doing modern stories.
From the government's perspective, but audiences like those films, even like today, kung fu film and the martial arts film, that's still part of the Chinese film legacy.
And how did Chinese cinema change then over the 20th century?
Then actually in the 1930s, because of the deepening of the Chinese national crisis with war, and then left-wing films started to take over. But actually in the 1930s, the so-called left-wing films are much more liberal. It's not something like you think about in propaganda terms, right? That's not the case. Many of these films are of high quality, artistic quality, I would say. And at the same time, they are socially and politically engaging. You can feel that this is not something from the government. These filmmakers, they wanted to make films like that to engage people. So that's the start of this kind of political films. Afterwards, China had an 8 years war with Japan, and they also made, with limited availability of equipment, they made some propaganda kind of films. And then soon afterwards, China moved into the civil war between the Communist Party and the Nationalist Party. And eventually, the Communist Party won. So then we move on to the socialist period that started in 1949. Then the film scene completely changed. More independent filmmaking was over.
Moving slightly away from Chinese cinema, you said you studied in mainland China. You said Peking University and Fudan.
Yes.
You did your PhD in Heidelberg in Germany. You are obviously in Edinburgh now, and you said that you've had grants that took you to France and to Austria. How does studying Chinese cultural history compare in all those different contexts?
Yeah, they are quite different. In mainland China, we have the depth of knowledge and all the details and the nuances, and with a large number of scholars looking at all sorts of nuanced aspects of Chinese history. Then I went to Germany to do my PhD. So this is quite a dramatic change, mainly in terms of perspectives. Because in German academia, I got to learn a wide range of perspectives to think about China. More like as an outsider. As an insider, you always understand your own country from certain perspectives, but an outsider, that is quite different. I think in mainland China, because it's so vast, and also my time, it was not really so open to the outside world. So we learned something in a particular way. But then in Germany, because Heidelberg was at that time very active academically in terms of Chinese studies or sinology in their own term. So we, as students, got to meet scholars from all around the world. Those, from China, from Taiwan, from Hong Kong, and also from US, from Europe. And then you get to know more about how the world understands China.
Chinese studies encompasses so much. I'm doing essentially media and cultural history, but I'm also using quite a lot of sociology in my theories, and that's sitting next to people doing ethnography and economic history and very different academic methodologies that would be in different departments if it was a different geographical focus.
Yeah, very true. We are very interdisciplinary. And the upside is really it gives you different views, perspectives, disciplinary insights. That's definitely the upside.
And within that, I guess, interdisciplinary context leads quite nicely into how did you go from Chinese cinema and media and cultural history to the history of smell? Because on the surface, that's quite a big jump.
Yeah, you're right. On surface, it's quite a big jump. And as I explained earlier, that was partly because of the practical needs. Right? I need to find a different project. And then the immediate inspiration is that I read a book written by a French historian, Alain Corbin, called The Foul and the Fragrant. It's a cultural history of the French olfactory revolution. So I was really inspired by that. And looking at the materials he used reminded me of Republican China, of the materials I used for my PhD dissertation for my first book, because although my first book, my dissertation was film history, I also used a lot of materials from the wide media, newspapers and pictorials and so on and so forth. So it is not really, it's changing the subject, but doesn't mean that you're changing the whole academic foundation and context. But you're right. Definitely, it is a different subject matter. So I also need to do lots of research to understand the scholarship on sensory history in general. So I always laugh at myself. As I said, I am a fox type of scholar. Some scholars, the hedgehog, right, is always very focused. And the benefit is certainly that you laid a very solid foundation. You've already read all these classics in your field. Then you build on that. Then you can start your next project and the next project. But for me, if I jump, then you have to grasp the foundation. So spend lots of time reading those classics and basic literature.
Yeah, I can very much relate though. It's the same sort of thing of going, what's this seminal text that everyone keeps quoting from? Because I don't have the art history training or the sociology training that actually may have led more straightforwardly to what I'm doing, but it's less fun that way, in my opinion.
There's no right or wrong, right? It's a different path.
And then in your book, Sense of China, which I have in my hand, you identify a conundrum that volatile odour molecules are not archivable in the same way as visual and acoustic sources. The historian of olfaction thereby has to rely on their historical agents' noses, or more precisely, textual and visual records of odours perceived through their noses, which really leads to how do you study smell? How do you study something that is so ephemeral and also so personal?
Because we certainly don't have a smell archive, so we still have to rely on more conventional textual sources. And then methodologically, there is no fundamental difference from researching wars. But then in terms of the specific focus of smell, you're right, it is certainly fleeting. But that is the interesting part of it, because if you look at the textual sources, you will find that there are so many. So when I just started this project, one of the questions I always was asked is that, how do you find materials about a smell? But actually, when you really pay attention, you will find that there are so many. So I used a wide range of sources, including some archival materials, but also some more like, you can call it marginal historical sources, including literature, including travel writing, including adverts. But these materials give you an insight into how people, ultimately it's about people, right? How people perceive smells differently. And then I use these sources or use their perceptions, trying to understand why and how they perceive that way. Then that always leads up to some more broader, grander forces of history That's what interests me, because as I said, even as tiny as smells, they are just some chemical molecules, but they are never trivial. They always tell you some deeper forces about history.
Following on from that, you're talking about the ideas of, I guess, power structures and sort of social order through smell. And in this one, I think you're talking now in 1947, and it's a propaganda pamphlet, so historian brain on that's going to be quite extreme language. It's going to be trying to push a point. As sickening stench penetrating through cracks in floorboards and walls was inescapable for the slum residents. Thriving mosquitoes, flies, and other insects transmitted diseases rapidly. It was a paragon of the vices of imperialism and the Nationalist Party. Conquering its stench and filth, therefore, was imperative for the new regime. So the idea, I guess, there is that smell is something perhaps that everybody experienced, so it's quite a good way of pushing these ideas of power, saying this is a negative thing, we can get rid of it.
Yeah, this quote, actually opens up a window for us to understand how smells are entangled with political powers. Because you can argue that even like this very much personal, private, intimate field as sensory perception, the political powers still wanted to manipulate that. That is the story of one of the chapters in my book, because this chapter looks at the concept of deodorization. It started in the mid-19th century in like Britain, France, because of the Industrial Revolution. Then the environments got worse, and then deodorization is part of the sanitary movements at that time. So they introduced the technology of the drainage system, also introduced institutions.
Immediately thinking of in Victorian periods in England, there was a great fog in London that was so bad that they had to close Parliament because it smelled so bad, because the sewage system wasn't built yet. And then there was a massive public infrastructure movement to make that better, so that the centre of London was not filled with this sort of noxious smog.
That's exactly the background in the West. But then, when the colonial officers went to China, when after the Opium Wars, China, some treaty ports were opened to Western powers. And then we have those settlements, concessions built within Chinese cities. So then these colonial officers, they started to implement exactly similar kinds of laws, institutions to try to deodorize Chinese environments. But I wanted to dig deeper to showing that actually this kind of deodorization schemes is never even or fair to everyone. So ultimately within Shanghai, that's my case study, you can see that actually this is a very uneven redistribution of smellscapes. Ultimately, deodorized zones are within the Western residence areas and those, powerful, wealthy people's residence areas. And we can see that the poorer people were relegated to the margins of the city, and with those areas it's never deodorized.
You focused on the sensory history of China, and specifically Shanghai, as your case study. And then after that, you led a project about smell in Scotland. What was it like moving away from Chinese studies, I guess, for the first time professionally?
The smell in Scotland, this is actually just a side project, because the sensory studies or smell studies is a rather small field. So I got to know scholars in English history, in European medicine. When I finished this book, I discussed with a colleague who's an English historian, and we decided to do something collaboratively. And since I'm based in Scotland, then we said, then why don't we apply for a grant to do a project on the smell of Scotland? We got this grant, and we did 3 workshops in Edinburgh. We explored different aspects of the history of smell in Scotland, including environment and the foodscape, and then the botanic history. So yeah, that was fun. But I found that on the one hand, it is certainly challenging because this is not my immediate field. But on the other hand, I really enjoy the process because then you can collaborate with others. You find something in common. Actually, there are so many things in common in terms of how smell engaged with history and the environment. Ultimately, I always think that we humans share more similarities than differences across nations and cultures, especially when it comes to sensory perception. So how smell engaged with memories, with emotions. And during my workshops last year, we just found that it's not like there is a big barrier between Scotland and China, between different academic backgrounds. We can communicate so well.
That's a really nice, optimistic, collaborative point to not quite finish on, but almost finish on, which would lead me then to my final question. What advice would you have to students in LLC at the moment? Anyone who's quite early on in an academic career, in a research career, what advice would you have to them?
The first, I would say, follow your heart. I think that passion is really something that drives you to research, to understand things, to find your archives. And so this is always follow your heart. This would be my first advice. The second, it's a very old-fashioned way to say this, but I would say read broadly. Because these days we are distracted by social media, by all sorts of digital products. But still, I think reading a book will give you something different. So a book is more like an organic unit that those fragmented social media posts wouldn't give you. So read broadly also means that you will get inspiration. That is also something I think fundamental for academic research, because academic research is not only about producing a standard work, right? It's always about you doing something that builds on other people's work, but you have to contribute some new insights into your field. So that is read broadly. And then third, because you ask me my advice for students, I would say that the third is very basic. That is, get the basics right. Get your foundation solid. That means you have to be rigorous in terms of making an argument, in terms of doing your literature review, in terms of finding your sources, your evidence to support your argument. These things, it's so basic, right? But sometimes basic things are important. So I think the rigor of scholarship, that is fundamental. And the final one, I would say, stay active and curious. So go to conferences, go to talks, and host your podcast like that. Find different ways to engaging with scholars, engaging with your fellow researchers, and you never know what this kind of communication will bring you. Generally, I would say there are always positive outcomes from communications with others. So that would be my last advice.
On that really wonderful piece of advice, I'm going to say thank you so much for sitting down with me. This has been a lovely excuse for me to get to pick your brain and hear more about your research and how everything connects.
Thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure to chat with you, not on the topics that are supervisory meetings, but on broader things, and these broader things are important. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this, you can go and listen to more episodes of Beyond the Books. You can find them on YouTube at the University of Edinburgh LLC. You can find them on Apple Podcasts, or you can head to the website llc.ed.ac.uk/research/beyond-the-books to find episodes from seasons 1 and 2, hosted by Ellen Davis Walker and Emma Aviett. I've been Beth Price, and you have been listening to Beyond the Books.